Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good. Thanks. How you doing, man?
Good, man. Just had a great real estate heavy weekend. We were busy at the rental. We were looking at new properties to consider. We were looking at Airbnbs. We were all over the map. So it was a good weekend. We were busy.
Nice, nice. Yeah, we did the same. I was out checking out a couple houses this weekend, and inside of one that, uh, we're trying to figure out what the next steps are. We've got another rental that hasn't really cash flowed like we had wanted it to, and just became vacant. So now we're trying to figure out if we fix that one up, sell it, and try to buy something else that cash flows a little better. Like doing all that kind of playing with the puzzle of real estate right now.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that it's not just like a lot of real estate that we do. At least isn't set it and forget it, right? It's you
Mhm.
have to stay tuned. You have to be paying attention to certain milestones. Like when a tenant turns over or when a rehab is finished, like we're wrapping up. So things like that just keep you on your toes.
Yeah, and some real estate is certainly more set it and forget it than others. Like we've had folks on that are more in the commercial space where the goal is to try to get something stabilized and just set it and forget it, right? That's kind of the intention in some investments. And then others, like what you and I do a lot of with the single family long-term rentals, those are very much, when they become vacant, it becomes a good question of do you sell it? Do you keep it? What do you do? So for us, we really enjoyed taking some of those worst performing properties as they become vacant and moving them on because generally, worst performing for us doesn't mean that it's a bad property or that it's a bad fit for somebody else. It's just a bad fit for our goals. And so, if we can continually readjust, that just feels like one way to optimize and still kind of fun to tinker with the puzzle of real estate, too.
And that's not that different than what people are used to with other investments, right? I mean, you don't just buy a stock and hold it forever, right? You tinker with it. You have your financial planner weigh in. You rebalance to a different index fund. You take different approaches that are either more hands off or more hands on, right? As those goals change, you reallocate and you find other investments that make more sense.
Yeah, and I know one thing that we've talked about is that you and I both value cash flow as kind of a defensive play to make sure that real estate is safe in the long term. That if it's cash flowing, if there's more money at the end of the month than the mortgage payment and the other expenses associated with the property, that's a good thing, and that helps to make sure that you are able to hold that for the long term in that investment. So. One of the things that we're finding, and we were just talking about before we hit record, is all the impact of interest rates right now, right? That can cause properties to be tougher to cash flow when you pencil in the math. A mortgage, the stuff we were getting at 4% and change just a little bit ago, now being 6% or more, like that's a big shift. And we found that also in the recent Under One course, where there were several markets where it was just hard to find cash flow, and so those variables tend to shift strategies and shift some of the considerations right now in real estate acquisition.
Yeah, it was amazing to see how much that transitioned during Nunda One, where when the course started, interest rates were 4%, 4.5%, and when we were done, it was like 6%, 6.5, 7%, and it was just in a couple of months. So I think as there's not just simply one way to do it. It forces you to get creative with your strategies. You can't just say, well, it has to be cash flow, it has to be this market, it has to be this, because it's not always going to work. You have to be able to adapt and try different things to achieve your goals.
Yeah, and one of the things we talked about too is that every few episodes we do a deep dive where we talk about a topic in greater depth than we have time to in an interview with a guest. And Blake and Zach were just on and love talking with those guys. They're very inspirational in their stories of kind of rapid expansion and tremendous growth. And like they're just doing a fantastic job. And they spoke quite a bit about cash flow and the value of cash flow but we weren't able to dive into as much on some of the strategy of how they've made that work in a market where I could hear other people like screaming at their car radio of like, but that doesn't work in my market, or like finding all these other problems of like how that's just really tough to find. And so we thought diving in deeper to cash flow in real estate and what to do when you're having trouble finding cash flow in this market, but if you also value that in your investing plan.
Yeah, I think when we were talking to try to set up this episode, we said, look, what are ways that if cash flow is still your goal, how do you achieve that, right? So rather than just saying, well, I can't find it, there's no options for me, what could you do to find it, right? Take the Robert Kiyosaki approach of not, I can't afford that, but how can I afford that? And so we thought there would be three key strategies to kind of force that cash flow. We thought we'd talk through each one of these. And so quickly those, and we'll dive into each one of these, but quickly those are change the location, maybe looking at a different market, for example. Two is change the property, so changing the type of property or converting the property in some way to increase that rent or that return. And three is change the strategy, either go to rent by the room, rent by the week, some sort of furnished rental, a short-term rental, all these different options that are available to us. So we're going to talk through each one of those, that how you can force that cash flow to happen.
Yeah, it seems like in a lot of situations we put rules on ourselves of like, well, if I'm going to invest, excuse me, I'm going to invest within 30 minutes of my market, or I'm going to invest only in single family rentals, or I'm going to invest only. But so in breaking some of those rules, that can cause opportunity for cash flow that we might not have seen previously. So that first one, changing the location, that's not that's something that you've done yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's also something you've done as a realtor. So can you put kind of both those hats on for a minute and talk through why changing location might make sense for different investors?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've talked with other investors from markets that they look at where they're at and they dream of houses that are under $200,000 that are just easier to save up a down payment for, or that have any potential of cash flowing. And again, I'm biased, right? Living here in Cleveland, I'm repping my Cleveland shirt here today for those that are watching. But for markets like Cleveland, where the houses are all of that caliber, where you can buy under 200,000, where there is cash flow potential, it looks totally crazy to somebody who's in LA or Boston or Seattle right now.
Yeah, and that does make sense because in some markets, those types of properties just don't exist. Or if they do exist, they're in areas where someone would not necessarily want to invest, right? So changing markets can open that up. At the same time, I know when I first got started, I wanted to be able to drive by that property. I wanted to be able to get inside that property. I felt compelled to make sure that I knew thoroughly what was going on by being able to physically be there. So how do you overcome some of those fears for clients that you work with, and how did you do it yourself?
Yeah, so for my clients, right, it's a lot of times working them with things like FaceTime and using good Google Drive docs. Like if I'll go through and view a property for them, and either they're live with me on FaceTime, or even if they're not, but we want to have a recording for it later, I'll go through and record that entire house, throw it up onto Google Drive, and then they can access that at any point. So if they're talking with a contractor, if they're reviewing the numbers again at home, if they're looking at it in their own time, they've got access to that property in a way that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. And again, that's very similar to what I've done investing on estate. Pictures and video go a long way, especially when you've got someone that you can trust on the ground that I can send out to the property to view it, to get great video, to look for the things that I want them to look for. And then you just have access to that at any point. So it honestly doesn't get that different than investing locally. The only difference is that physicality. But once you get over that hump of, all right, I'm going to have somebody else do this, it actually isn't that different, to be honest.
Yeah, and one of the things too that I like about getting those videos and putting them in a Google Drive or some storage is that you can go back and look at that later. For instance, say you look at the property, then you buy the property later, you're trying to do your materials order, and it's like, shoot, is that a gas stove or an electric stove? Well, you can go back to the video and you can watch and see, like, is there a gas or an electric plug right there? Same with counting curtains or other things that you might need. Like, how many windows were there in that house? You can go back to those videos and it can save yourself a lot of time also. Even if you are going there physically yourself, doing a quick video can really help you with keeping all these different houses straight, particularly because you're probably not looking at just one property, making one offer and getting that house, right? Like most people in this market are jumping around to different houses, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny, you were talking about the video and looking at things after the fact. I had a property, excuse me, I had a property that we were looking at, and I forgot to measure one part of the countertop, and I was going to the counter guy to get a new counter ordered. And it didn't have to be perfect, but it had to be close so that we could figure out at least what slabs would work. And I couldn't remember for the life of me how long this counter was, but I pulled up the video and I just counted the 4x4 tiles along the back of the countertop, and I could figure out immediately, oh yeah, this is actually 6 feet. There you go. So we could actually make a rough measurement from that video. So it's a kind of again, like you said, it's a great way to go back and reference that. And if you're looking at multiple homes, like you just said, it can get overwhelming to try to remember all those, especially when you've never been inside any of them. So having those videos to go back to, segmenting them out into their own little folders, it can make a world of difference.
Yeah, and sometimes there can be details in there that, if you were going to live there personally, there might be something about being inside of it and really, really understanding that property in depth. And But for a lot of properties that are investment properties, you're more just looking for general information about that property. How does it generally feel? What's the layout like? What are the size of the rooms? And as long as it kind of fits the criteria of there's probably a lot of people that would enjoy staying there or living there, well, then that's probably a fit. You may not need to be as picky as if you're going to live there personally. So sometimes not being there can kind of help you get through some of those, analysis paralysis type things that pharmacists can find their way into real fast, and then just separate out and say, this is an investment. Let's see if this works. And then let's move on.
Yeah. So option one, change the location. And again, we talked through that now on other episodes as well. Even check out episode 62 about buying a house you've never walked into. So that's a good one. And that leads me to our second point. So David, we talked about point number 2 being changing that property in some way, changing that investment to make the cash flow work. And I know you've done this before. So talk to us a little bit how you help to find that cash flow.
Yeah, we really enjoy looking for ways to improve cash flow on a property. There's oftentimes things that you can do to a property to change it in some way that can increase the rent and then increase the cash flow by trying to figure out those local expectations for rentals, how you can meet those expectations, and how you can drive value in that market by making those changes to a property.
So something like improving the quality of a property, then like what do you mean by that? What are some of the things that you've done to really, bump up a property's quality?
Yeah, I think quality tends to mean something, at least for us, in terms of cosmetics. So we're always looking for what's kind of a safe property and a functional property. But then in terms of quality, there are some things you could do, like maybe you're going to rip out a kitchen and put in new like white shaker cabinets and new stainless steel appliances and those kind of things. And that may in certain markets help your buyer pool, like looking for people that are looking for some of those higher end features that are willing to pay for that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that's also things that may reduce your long-term maintenance costs. Like if you can rip up carpet and put in a good looking vinyl plank hard surface that's waterproof that you can just like mop when you're done rather than have to replace carpet constantly between tenants, that can also decrease costs, increase value, increase rent. And so those kind of things that can both help your repair costs over time and help drive up the rents because you're creating a higher quality property, those things can help from a cash flow standpoint for sure.
Yeah, one of the things I like to do in our market where there's a lot of rentals and a lot of comparable properties is that if you want to target a higher rent rate, right? Like let's say you're looking at in the $1,500 range, but you want to bump it up to the $1,700 range. Well, if you look at all the houses that are in that $1,700 range or $1,750 and above, make sure your fixtures match so that when you list your property higher and somebody's comparing it, you're not the oddball that sticks out, right? So if you're and that works no matter what price point you're targeting, but it's a great way to elevate yourself into that higher rent rate is to look at what rent rate you're trying to target and then make sure you match so you don't stick out.
And not just that, but making sure that when you look at the comps, you're not saying, hey, I'll bet that if I did all this, I could get 1750 when nothing out there is rented for 1750, exactly. Right? Like if 1500 is the absolute top, then don't try to put in granite and all these other things. You don't try for a $50,000 rehab, hoping that someone will magically pay extra. There are also kind of neighborhood thresholds, and that's where a good property manager and or a good realtor can really help you to narrow in what are those finishes that would be expected in this area that would drive the increased rent.
And I think the other thing that we often forget about is that we're looking at this so much in a short term, right? We're trying to make this decision to happen today or this rent increase happen today. But there's also that long term, right? Hopefully, rents are slowly increasing over time in your market. And so if you're making these changes now, getting it bumped up to a certain level, it hopefully will continue to increase from there. That helps you survive those leaner years right at the beginning. But ideally, over the long term, it's going to become a better and better investment as time goes on.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. I think one other thing that we look at is changing the function of the property. So we talked about quality, but I think function here also matters. So, a couple examples here. So one example was we took a duplex that had one furnace powering both units and one electric panel and meter for both units. And so in that situation, it was landlord paid utilities. So we had a professional come in, definitely not me, and install a new electrical panel, right? And a new furnace upstairs. And by doing that, we were able to split that out so that each tenant was responsible for their own gas and electric, but then also had some more control over that. So they could set the thermostat at their own temperature rather than have to negotiate that through between the two units, those kind of things. So increase in some quality, increase in getting the expenses off of the landlord's plate and to the tenants. So even though that landlord paid heat, while desirable, didn't really seem to increase the rent.
Mhm.
So by splitting that out, we were able to drop the rent, but pass that expense on so that it was better for the landlord. And then the tenant also felt kind of more in control of that as well.
And it's a great example, and one that is a good reminder of why it's so important to know what's typical for your area, right? And looking at a good realtor, a good property manager to know what is typical, because if a single boiler and that's going to provide heat for everybody, and heat is always included for all the rentals in the area, it might totally shock somebody when they've got an X rent and a Y, split utility fee that no other property has that split utility fee. And now your property is way outpriced, even though it's nicer. Again, like we said, if there's nobody to compare to, or it's not typical for that area, it may not be something that somebody wants to rent. So you have to make sure that what you're doing is one, helpful, but also typical for your area, and not just going to price yourself out.
Yeah, we see that all the time in our area too. Just about a half hour down the road from this other duplex, there's this area where there's all these. I refer to. There's probably a better name for them. Like I'm sure you know. I tend to think of them as like brick and boiler 4 units, because there are all these brick buildings with 2 up, 2 down, and a boiler that powers all of it. And so those properties, yes, heat is always included, right? Or there may be some sort of utility rider or something that goes on top of the monthly rent. So yes, definitely knowing those areas can be really important to make sure that you're meeting those expectations. Same kind of concept as you don't want to be the only one trying to get 1750 in a market where everyone can only charge 1500 a month for rent.
What about? I know you've had examples of this in the past, David, where you're taking the actual functionality of a home and changing that too, right? So it's not just heat versus shared, or separate versus shared, but like the actual functionability of a house.
Yeah. So this is good. So the second example I have is taking a duplex where we had a property that just had a really terrible layout.
Mhm.
So in this case, there were 2 small bedrooms and this giant L-shaped living room. And it didn't make sense. It was just weird. Everybody that walked through it just kind of did one of these, like, as they're looking around, like, what's going on with this house? But what everyone said consistently, even everybody walked in there, was like, why don't you just cut this and make this a bedroom? And then you'd have just a very typical shape living room. And then you would have a very big master bedroom. And so we were able to convert this awkward, why would you want to live here space that was only a 2-bed into a 3-bed, like very functional, very proper space. And so in doing that, it was just a small stretch of wall, a door, some reconfiguration. I think there was a window in there and all that. But in doing that, we were able to increase rents by 100 or 200 a month versus what we were going to get previously. So again, a small expense up front to generate an extra couple hundreds a month. So let's just say that was a $3,000 update
Mhm.
for a for $200 a month rent. I mean, you're going to make that back very, very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think about a typical duplex in my market, right? We're talking probably $200,000 to $225,000, somewhere in that range for a typical duplex like you're describing. And if you're going from $1,000 a month per side to 1,200 per side, now you're talking about $2,400 a month in rent. That all of a sudden can make or break that deal, right? You could take something from $100 a month in cash flow, or breaking even with our interest rates today, to more than $400 or $500 because of that $400 increase. I mean, that's huge. That all of a sudden that property becomes a contender just because of a couple $1,000 upgrade.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why pictures on the MLS and being inside and having those videos can really help you to understand those hidden opportunities. Maybe there's a basement that could be finished, or a den in a property that I don't know why it's being advertised as a den that could be easily converted to a bedroom, or it's shared utilities and you look at everything else in the area and it could be split. So some markets are only just a small improvement away from working, and where some kind of creative improvement to that property can kind of get it across the finish line from like, I just don't think I can make that work, to that would be a great property. And so in other instances, this may not be enough, right? So, and that can bring us to kind of the third rule that we talk about breaking, the third strategy of, you know, changing the whole strategy of how you rent out a property. Can you take us through that for a minute?
Yeah, I think we focus a lot on long-term buy and hold rental investing. I think because it's simple. We've tried it several times. It's the boring, right, get rich slow scheme that I think works really well for us as pharmacists, and it's part of our investment strategy. But if you're willing to do a little more work, there are a lot more options out there, and we've had several people on the show in the past to talk about some of those options.
Yeah, I know. Ryan Shaw back on episode 12 talked about renting by the room. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking about?
Yeah, that's where I was going, right? So things like renting by the room, it's a great way to improve cash flow. I mean, Ryan has only a couple of units or a couple of properties, but because he's able to rent out each room, he really increases the overall rent that he's generating from those properties. In fact, he's in a really expensive market. He's out in California, where most people are looking at that and saying, look, this long-term single person in this house, it's never going to cash flow. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to buy that property. But Ryan looks at it and says, well, I can put 4 students in those 4 bedrooms. They each have access to, a shared bathroom each. And now they're, comfortable, happy. They're paying less than they would in a single family home, but I'm generating more rent overall. Win-win for everybody. And now it's actually an investment opportunity. And so I think he was, if I look back at the numbers, I'll have to double check it, but it was like $10,000 a month in cash flow or more on just 4 properties, because or not cash flow, but in net income or gross income, excuse me, on just 4 properties, because he's able to increase that rent rate by the room.
Yeah, and he's able to do it by that strategy of renting by the room, but still long term. He doesn't have to do kind of the cleaning and all those things between nightly or weekly tenants, and still improves return. We've also had folks on the podcast that have talked about those short-term rental plays where even with nightly or weekly cleaning and furnishing a place out to be more of a vacation destination, there's also money to be made there. Is that right?
Yeah, this is really where I'm trying to go next, right? I really want to get a short-term rental soon, just to try it out, right? Just like when I bought my first long-term rental, it didn't have to be perfect. I want to try it and see how it goes. And we've had tons of guests that talk about that, about how that short-term rental strategy, either nightly, weekly, sometimes even monthly rentals, those medium-term type distances or durations, excuse me, it can really help to change the cash flow picture, right? You just buy some fixtures, some furniture, dress the place up a bit more than your typical, long-term rental listing. And all of a sudden you've got, a mid-term rental that can really change the cash flow picture without doing too much different in terms of that property itself.
Yeah, it sounds like that might work particularly in a pricier market. Is that right?
Yeah, we're in markets where what I'm seeing a lot of people do is where if the laws or the regulations are not allowing you to do it as a short-term rental and the cash flow doesn't work as a long-term rental, well, some of those municipalities will allow you to do a 30-day or longer rental. And so they'll do 3 or 6 month rentals, or even just a month-long rental to traveling nurses or students that are on rotations, for example. And those are great ways to work within the regulations of a location, generating lots of extra cash flow and not breaking the bank.
Yeah. So definitely strategies that, yes, if you're willing to roll up your sleeves and work a little more or coordinate that work being done or hire a property manager that will manage all that work getting done, those medium term, short term, rent by the room, those kind of other strategies may make a property work in a market where simply changing the property or changing the market isn't necessarily a fit for your investing strategy.
And if we're interested in that, if you're interested in that, we'll throw a couple of those episodes that had guests talking about that in the show notes. A couple come to mind, but I want to make sure we get them all in there. So check the show notes for more of the episodes that had guests trying those strategies. There's also some great resources out there, just if you're interested in learning more about this. One of the ones that I've been using recently is AirDNA. I know this has come up on the show in the past, but it's a great way to assess a market. It's a paid service. You have to buy into it a little bit just to get access to some of the data. But it's a great way to see what a rental listing has done over time. And it's just one tool in a big toolbox of things that you should be looking at. But if you're looking for more information about that, we'll throw some stuff in the show notes. We've covered this on a couple episodes in the past. So.
Love it. Love it. So that wraps up kind of the 3 things that you can think about changing, the 3 rules to break in an investing strategy to make sure that you are aligning your investing with your goals. And so that could be first one, changing the location. Second one, changing the property somehow itself. and the third one, changing the strategy. So any other closing thoughts, Nate?
Yeah, I think just that if you are interested in trying to figure this out, right? If you're looking at your first investment property, or maybe just looking at your next investment property, and all of a sudden the numbers don't work, I'd encourage you to come to our Facebook group, right? Check out the YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. Maybe throw something out there. Hey, I'm an investor from Milwaukee, and it doesn't work here anymore. Like, where are you guys at? And can we collaborate on something? Like, I think that's a great way to start finding other locations. I think one of the things that often happens when you're changing strategies or doing any of the three things that we just talked about, is that it feels like, well, I just learned everything over here, and now I don't know how to take that next step and do it all over again somewhere else, or with a different strategy, or with a different type of property. And so we've got, again, a whole community of people that have done all this stuff in different locations, others that have tried these different strategies and tried different ways to change properties. And so I really encourage you to check out that Facebook group if you've not already joined. Great way to connect with other people that are doing this stuff, so that you can find somebody to help you out on the way.
No, that sounds perfect. I think getting that second set of eyes and that second opinion is always helpful when you're just stuck with your investing and trying to find an answer to a complex puzzle.
Great. Well, hope you guys found some value in that. And with that, we'll hopefully see you in the Facebook group. And otherwise, we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.